For today's case, we have to travel all the way to Fall City, located in Washington, United States. According to the latest census taken there, the population barely exceeds 1,600 residents, making it one of those places where everyone knows each other, creating a sense of a close-knit community where crimes or criminal acts rarely ever happen. Or at least, nothing terrible ever happened until October 21st, 2024, when a mass homicide took place at the Humiston house, leaving only two of the seven family members alive. So today, we're covering the case of the Humiston family massacre. And with nothing more to add, let's get started. Even though Fall City is a very nice and safe town, its rather laid-back pace of life means that there are hardly any changes in its population. In other words, people don't usually move there. And that's why, when it was announced in 2018 that one of the most luxurious houses on Lake Road had been sold, there was a kind of widespread excitement among all the residents, eager to find out who the new family moving into the house at 7715 would be. The 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house, with over 4,000 square meters on a property of 2.5 hectares, was bought for just under $2 million by Mark Humiston, a 37-year-old man originally from a town just as small as Fall City, but in Ohio, called Marion. Although we don't know much about his childhood, we do know that Mark didn't spend his whole life in Marion. When he was 9 years old, in 1980, he and his family moved to Texas, where Mark finished elementary school and continued his education at Colleyville High School. There, he joined the school band, playing the trombone, and after some time in the band, he became its captain. Beyond just participating in this extracurricular activity at school, Mark was also a dedicated and active member of the Boy Scouts of America, achieving the prestigious rank of Eagle Scout, which is the highest rank in that entire organization. This rank can only be earned after obtaining at least 21 merit badges before turning 18, a challenging milestone that Mark had actually far surpassed, thus becoming part of the elite 4% of Boy Scouts who ever reached that rank. He continued participating in the organization until he graduated from high school, when he decided to focus on his college studies at Texas State University, where he studied electrical engineering and graduated relatively quickly. After earning his degree, Mark decided to become independent and moved to Seattle, probably in search of work or simply because he wanted to start a new chapter in his life. Of course, he kept many of the values his parents had raised him with, such as regularly attending church, something that was not only important to them, but also to Mark, who was a deeply religious person and very connected to his faith. Moving to a completely new city on his own was a huge change for him, so he decided to find comfort in the church he had chosen, and also use that place to meet new people. It was while participating in the congregation's activities that he met Sarah. Unlike Mark, Sarah, who was born on November 17th, 1981, was originally from Seattle, where she had grown up with her family. Age wasn't the only thing she had in common with Mark. Just like him, Sarah loved music, and even more so, playing it. As a child, she had learned to play the piano and the flute, but she didn't stop at just those instruments. In high school, she joined the jazz choir, where instead of playing the piano, she started singing until she graduated. Even though she loved music, Sarah knew it wasn't realistic to make a career out of it. So when she finished high school, she chose to study nursing, a calling she had dreamed of since she was a little girl. She studied at the University of Washington, where she joined the Chi Omega sorority, whose core values are friendship, integrity, service to others, and intellectual goals, things that matched Sarah's personality. She was one of the most active members until 2000, when she finally graduated. Just like Mark, Sarah came from a family deeply committed to their faith and congregation, so she took part in all the activities at her church, even when it meant coming home tired after working in the oncology unit at Swedish Hospital. Unfortunately, we don't have all the details about Mark and Sarah's relationship, so we don't know exactly when they met or how long they dated, but we do know they got married on May 12, 2007. Although they didn't start a family right away, for about 4 years, they chose to focus on their respective careers, while also starting to save up for when they would have children, a dream they both shared. Their first child was Andrew, who was born 2 years after the couple got married. For a while, Andrew was an only child, until the family grew again with the birth of Benjamin. The birth of their second child was a turning point. Mark and Sarah wanted to have a big family, but to make that dream come true, they needed to change their way of life. Both of them had long work days, and often their jobs required them to put in hours outside of their regular schedule. After several conversations, Sarah decided to quit her job as a nurse to focus on their two children. Shortly after that decision, the couple became pregnant again, and their first daughter, Brielle, was born. This was the last baby they had for about 4 years, a period they probably took to adjust to their new life. According to some sources, around that time, Mark got a significantly better job, although it came with greater responsibilities. This required him to focus more on his work at first, without neglecting his family. Mark devoted all his free time to his children and wife, but he knew it wasn't the best time to keep growing the family. That's why they didn't have another child until May 1st, 2015, when Joshua was born. Finally, in October 2017, Catherine was born. Her name was chosen in honor of the nickname of one of her grandmothers, whom the family affectionately called KDB. Catherine's birth marked a new chapter in the Humiston family's life. The house they had been living in up to that point in Seattle was definitely too small for them. There were 7 people living there, and that brought up the possibility of moving. Since it wasn't something they needed to do quickly, Mark and Sarah took their time to look for a house they truly liked. Naturally, they started looking in Seattle, but after several months without finding a property they liked, they began to consider the possibility of moving outside the city. It was Mark who suggested leaving the city to settle in a quieter place, a small town like Marion, where he had grown up and lived for the first 9 years of his life. It didn't take much for Sarah to accept her husband's proposal. She loved the idea of their children growing up in a closer-knit community instead of a huge city like the one they lived in. With the decision made to leave the city, the couple began looking for houses outside of Seattle, which wasn't an easy task. They spent more than a year searching until they found the house located at 7715 Alice Road in the quiet Lake Road neighborhood. Built in 1990, the 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house was closer to being a mansion than an ordinary home. Among its amenities was a beautiful fireplace in the living room, along with a huge space for the family. The master bedroom had a luxurious ensuite bathroom that even included a jacuzzi. Although all these amenities were obviously a significant advantage, what the Humistons liked most, including the kids, was the incredibly spacious backyard, which stretched all the way back to a wooded area. This gave Mark and Sarah a wonderful feeling of privacy, and their children a true sense of adventure. After confirming that Falls City met all the conditions they were looking for, Mark bought the house for about $1.5 million from its owners, an older couple who had lived there for more than 20 years. Finally, the Humistons moved in 2018 and took the opportunity to make some other changes in their lives, such as having their children stop attending a traditional school and instead start homeschooling with Sarah. The news hardly surprised anyone around them, since for several years the couple had expressed their desire for their children not to be raised with values that weren't their own, so the fact that they chose to homeschool was something many people saw coming. Even though the 5 Humiston children didn't go to school like the others, the family was far from isolating themselves from the rest of the community, at least at first. During their early days in Falls City, both the children and the couple used to take part in activities organized by the community. It was common to see the children riding their bikes along the streets of Lake Road, although they didn't necessarily play with the other kids or make friends. Beyond that, all their neighbors described the Humiston children as polite and quiet kids. Since they were only young children, there isn't much we can say about each of them individually, but as far as we know, as they grew up, Ben started to develop a deep interest in music, so encouraged by his supportive parents, he learned to play both the piano and the guitar. But at the same time, he also loved robotics. He was often considered the funniest of the siblings and loved spending time with them, so it was common to see him outside the house playing with his brothers or building things with his Legos, almost always robots. Joshua, the youngest of the boys, really looked up to his older brothers, so he shared several of their hobbies, like their love for Lego blocks. However, since he was a bit younger than Benjamin, building things only kept him entertained for a while, so when he got bored, his choice was always the same: jumping on the backyard trampoline, unless his mom was working in the garden. If Sarah was doing something out there, Joshua would choose to help her. He loved getting his hands in the dirt and spending time with his mom, something he shared with his little sister. Being the youngest, Katie was without a doubt the most spoiled of the five, but that wasn't just because of her age, it was also because of her personality. Even though she was quite small, Katie had a unique charisma. Her laughter was contagious, so it was impossible to stay mad at her. Andrew seemed to be a very protective older brother. When the others played in the street, he was the one who watched over them and took care of them, even though he was entering adolescence. At first, his personality wasn't any different from his siblings. He was always polite to neighbors and strangers. He was consistently more than willing to help or collaborate with those around him, but as the years went by, Andrew started to act in a noticeably different manner. Unlike his younger siblings, Andrew had never really liked the idea of not going to school, like most people, and that started to show in his academic performance. By 2023, his grades had dropped drastically, but instead of talking to his father about the reasons for this change, Andrew began to isolate himself from his family. He stopped spending time with his siblings, refused to take part in activities that had become family traditions, and instead spent all his time in his room. Up until then, as the oldest, Andrew had had various responsibilities at home, but overnight he refused to do them, which led his parents to demand that he go back to behaving as he used to, but the teenager ignored them. In the following months, the situation got worse. Sarah discovered that Andrew was spending much more time online or playing video games than he was allowed, and with games that neither she nor her husband had previously approved. However, the turning point came when, after checking his history, Sarah found out that her oldest son had been watching adult content. That led to a huge argument between him and his parents. Sarah even felt betrayed by her oldest son, disappointed by the way Andrew was behaving. The 41-year-old former nurse started to show just how disappointed she was in him, but that didn't lead to the results she wanted. Instead of apologizing to her or Mark, Andrew withdrew even further from his parents. From his point of view, the couple felt a kind of contempt for him, and for that very reason, they focused on everything he did wrong and showed much more love to his siblings than to him, even though until recently he had been the only one helping his mother with chores around the house and everything else. Feeling more and more isolated from his family and convinced that he wasn't loved, Andrew started looking for a solution to his problems, and he found it by searching websites, especially those that talked about weapons, crime scenes, and fake suicides. A macabre idea had taken root in his mind, and that's how he began to plan the solution to all his problems. After several weeks of planning every detail, on October 21st, 2024, around 4:30 in the morning, he put his plan into action. While the whole family was asleep and without making a sound, the 15-year-old teenager left his room and walked to the front door of the house. In a cabinet nearby, his father kept his 9mm Glock pistol in a gun box. For those who aren't familiar with firearms and safe ways to store them, a gun box is basically a box that looks a lot like a briefcase or a toolbox, specifically designed to safely store firearms. And unlike an ordinary toolbox, gun boxes are designed so that not just anyone can open them, but only the person responsible for the weapon. Some have biometric locks, meaning they open, for example, with a fingerprint, and others, like the one Mark, the owner of the gun, had, opened like a safe, meaning it had a code. To prevent any tragedy, Mark had decided that, besides himself, only 2 people would have the code: his wife and Andrew. This was in case he ever needed to defend the house, his mother, or his siblings. Obviously, Mark never imagined that Andrew would open the gun box, not to protect his family, but to destroy it. Once Andrew had the gun in his hands, he retraced his steps and entered Brielle's room, who was 11 years old at the time. Like the rest of her family, the girl was sleeping comfortably in her bed when the sound of her brother's footsteps made her open her eyes. Although she woke up before Andrew pointed the gun at her, The shock kept her from reacting before Andrew fired the first shot, injuring her neck. In an attempt to protect herself, Brielle raised one of her hands as if to block the next shot, which came just a couple of seconds later, passing through her hand and breaking several of her bones in the process. Despite the horrific pain, the shock, and especially her age, Brielle realized that her older brother wasn't going to stop until she was dead. So instead of screaming for help, she let herself fall onto the bed and held her breath, pretending to be dead. After a few seconds, Andrew thought she was dead, left her, and went out of the room, heading down to the basement, where there was this huge family area that at the time served as a bedroom for Joshua, Catherine, and Mark, who slept there with them to keep them company. After going down the stairs, Andrew first saw his father, who was lying on one of the couches. Without saying a word, and before Mark could wake up, the teenager aimed and shot him in the left shoulder, which obviously woke up the 43-year-old man, who tried to get up but couldn't, since he had barely sat up when his oldest son fired 2 more times. The first shot hit under his left armpit, and the second struck the lower part of his back, causing him to immediately fall to the floor, unable to stand up. Still alive, Mark tried to crawl or alert his 2 younger sons, but before he could, Andrew shot him a 4th time, hitting him in the neck and causing a fatal wound that made him bleed out within minutes. Without even giving him a few minutes of attention, Andrew noticed that his youngest sister was lying on the floor next to the couch. And before the 7-year-old girl could fully react, the teenager aimed at her head and fired. The bullet entered through one side of her skull and ended her life instantly. Her body lay lifeless next to her father's, who had tried to warn her of the danger. When Andrew's eyes met those of terrified 9-year-old Joshua, he wasn't moved at all. With the same coldness with which he had shot 3 members of his family, he aimed at the boy's forehead and pulled the trigger. The bullet entered through that spot and exited the back of his head, causing him, like his younger sister, to die instantly. Andrew turned that basement, where his family used to spend time together having fun or relaxing, into a horrifying crime scene. But he was still far from finished. Hearing the gunshots coming from the basement, 13-year-old Benjamin woke up and quickly ran down there to find out what had happened. Andrew's plan was working even better than he had expected, so without moving from beside the bodies of his siblings and father, he raised the gun and shot Ben twice. The first shot hit his left cheek, passing through all the soft tissue, causing his face to become disfigured from the wound. The second bullet entered just behind his right ear and traveled diagonally into his skull, where it became lodged. It was the second shot that ended the boy's life instantly. Andrew had already attacked 5 members of his family and had effectively ended the lives of 4, although he believed it was all 5. But he still had his mother left. Sarah was sleeping at that moment in the master bedroom when, just like then, the sound of gunshots woke her up. Unlike her son, the former nurse didn't run downstairs to find out what was happening. Instead, following her instincts, she locked herself in the bathroom of the bedroom and, extremely terrified, tried to hide next to the jacuzzi. However, her attempts to protect herself would be in vain. Just a few minutes after the last shot in the basement, she could feel someone entering her room and starting to kick the bathroom door. Andrew wasn't going to let her get away, so he kept forcing the door until it gave way and he was able to get in. We can't know if Sarah begged him not to do it or tried to talk to him, but what we do know is that the teenager shot her several times at close range. One of the bullets entered behind her right ear and exited through her cheek. The fatal shot turned out to be the one that entered through her left temple and lodged behind her eye, causing Sarah to collapse lifeless onto herself in a huge pool of blood. Scarcely more than 20 minutes had passed since the Hamiltons' house had been transformed into a living hell when the young man went back down to the basement to carry out a crucial phase of his plan. He approached Ben's body and carefully placed the weapon he had used in his hand, framing the youngest for his gruesome actions. After doing this, he ran up the stairs to the main floor of the house and at 4:55 called 911. With short, shaky breaths and a trembling voice, he announced, "He shot my whole family," and then he took his own life. Given how nervous the teenager appeared to be, the operator tried to calm him down using a variety of calming techniques before asking him exactly what had happened. A bit calmer, Andrew told her that his 13-year-old brother Benjamin had started shooting at the whole family, and that's why he had hidden in the bathroom on the first floor. He even said that he thought his brother had done it because the day before, their parents had caught him watching adult content. He also added that he had just come out of the bathroom to make the call and that it had been about 10 to 15 minutes since he heard the last gunshot. What he didn't know was that at 5:02 in the morning, 911 had received another call from Ellis Road. It came from the house of one of the family's neighbors, Bradley Dennis. Bradley, still somewhat in shock, explained that his neighbor's 11-year-old daughter had just rung his doorbell, completely covered in blood and badly injured. When he asked her what happened, Brielle told him through tears that her family had been shot and that everyone had been killed. Naturally, Bradley brought the girl into his house and called the authorities while he tried to find out more about what had happened at the Humiston house. In a state of frenzy brought on by nerves and even pain, Brielle explained to him that Andrew had shot her, and that to keep him from doing it again, she pretended to be dead while she listened to the gunshots in the rest of the house. When everything went quiet again and she heard her brother lock himself in the bathroom on the main floor, the girl gathered all her strength and escaped from the house through the emergency window, running to the nearest place, the home of Bradley Dennis. Emergency services soon notified the Kings County Sheriff's Office about the two calls, and a few minutes later, several police cars were dispatched to that house on Ellis Road. They weren't responding to a victim's call, but rather going to arrest the culprit, or at least the main suspect. When they arrived, Andrew was apparently waiting for them at the entrance of the house, looking distressed, and to his surprise, he was immediately placed under arrest. He was then taken to the Sammamish police station, where he was offered the chance to speak with detectives, but the teenager flatly refused to do so without a lawyer present. While Brielle was being treated for her injuries at the hospital, the police set about analyzing the grotesque crime scene that Andrew Humiston had left behind. The first bodies to be discovered and identified were the ones in the basement. Mark's body was lying right at the bottom of the stairs, partially on top of his son Joshua's. Catherine's body, meanwhile, was not far from the others, but more in the hallway, while Benjamin's, the supposed culprit according to Andrew, was found with a weapon, a 9mm Glock, in his hand. The bloodstains and the way the bodies of the two younger ones and the father were found indicated that they were attacked while trying to escape, or at least trying to reach the stairs to go up. Initially, considering that Ben had the weapon in one of his hands and was a bit farther from the bodies, closer to the center of the room, all the evidence appeared to suggest that the 13-year-old boy had opened fire on his family and then taken his own life. But this assumption wouldn't last long. The fourth body, Sarah's, was found in the bathroom of her room, and unlike the basement, the scene there seems somehow more erratic. They found at least one shell casing next to the sink, but also the bathroom door was clearly damaged. With two witnesses telling different stories, the investigators focused first on Ben's body. Before even moving him to the morgue, they took a sample from his hands with a swab to see if there were traces of gunpowder, which would be expected if he had fired the weapon. And keep in mind that the culprit fired a lot of shots, so it wasn't like he could just wash his hands and that was it before dying. He should have been covered in gunpowder residue. The test was pretty straightforward. There was no gunpowder on the young man's hands. This was the first sign that Andrew Humiston had lied, but it wouldn't be the only one. The way the blood splattered indicated that the bodies had been moved from their original positions, suggesting possible tampering with the scene. However, suspicions were confirmed by the results of the autopsies performed over the next 3 days. The autopsy report on Ben's body confirmed that no blood splatter was found on the boy's hands. In addition, it was reported that his gunshot wounds lacked the typical burn mark that a firearm barrel leaves on the skin. In other words, the absence of this mark around the wound showed that the boy had not taken his own life, as his older brother claimed, but rather that someone had shot him from a certain distance. As for the other autopsies, in cases like Mark and Sarah's, their own blood was found in their lungs, indicating that at least those two victims had been alive for at least a few seconds after the attack and had inhaled their own blood. According to investigators, this information demonstrated not only the intentionality of the attacks, but even more so their deliberateness. But the sheriff's office didn't just rely on the autopsy results. They also conducted a series of ballistic analyses to determine whether someone of Ben's height, shooting from the position suggested by the scene, could actually hit his family members the way he did, and whether his own wounds supported the suicide theory. Just like the autopsies, the results of these analyses rejected Andrew's version about his younger brother's guilt. The bullet trajectories simply didn't match what he was saying. However, the most compelling piece of evidence was Brielle's testimony, not only because the girl had been awake at the time of the attack, but also because during her statement, she added extremely important information, such as the fact that, besides her parents, only Andrew had access to his father's gun. As if that weren't enough, when conducting a thorough search of the boy's computer, the police discovered that in the weeks leading up to the crimes, Andrew had been actively researching detailed information online about how to shoot a gun, what suicide scenes looked like, and other specific details that closely aligned with the investigators' theory that the teenager had spent many weeks meticulously planning all of this to carry out his plan. With more than enough evidence to charge him as guilty, Andrew was placed under arrest and later officially charged with 5 counts of homicide, with the aggravating factor of premeditation, which was fully proven, as well as 1 count of attempted homicide in Brielle's case. The first court hearing is always the formal reading of the charges, and in this case, it took place just 5 days after the events, that is, on October 25th, 2024. During that hearing, the charges against the teenager were made official, and as is customary in these hearings, he was asked how he pleaded, something Andrew chose not to answer. In addition to setting the dates and schedule for the upcoming hearings, this first stage of the judicial process was marked by motions from both sides. On one hand, Andrew's defense team requested that, given his age, his identity be protected. Judge Kristen Richardson, who presided over the case, partially granted this request by prohibiting the media from taking videos or photos of the defendant inside or outside the courtroom, or from using his full name in news reports. That's why, to this day, the American press simply refers to him as A. The defendant's age was already a complication in itself. Although in the United States, 16 and 17-year-olds accused of homicide are automatically tried as adults, since Andrew was 15, it was still up for debate whether his trial would be held in adult court or not. From the very first hearing, the King County Prosecutor's Office requested that he be tried as an adult, but the judge decided that this wouldn't happen without a prior determination process, which, of course, involved a series of hearings before the actual trial. The first of these was supposed to take place in January 2025, but Andrew's defense filed motions to delay it, arguing that they needed more time to gather evidence and interview the 100 people they considered to be of interest. After a brief discussion, the postponement of the hearing was granted, and it ended up taking place in the middle of last year. Thanks to what was leaked from that hearing, we know that the defense presented a series of pieces of evidence and testimonies that, in a way, change how we understand this case. And according to what local media outlets reported, Andrew's lawyers maintain that his actions were driven and provoked by a series of prolonged abuses that the teenager had suffered at the hands of his family. For the first time since the events occurred, the Humiston family dynamic was being questioned, and whether they were really the perfect family that had initially been portrayed. The reports presented by the teenager's defense indicated that Mark and Sarah deliberately isolated their children, trying at all costs to prevent them from forming relationships with people outside the family, which is why they had chosen to homeschool them. This claim was based on various testimonies from the Hamiltons' neighbors, who stated that although the family took part in community social activities, it was uncommon to see them interact with anyone outside of a few families from their church. Thanks to the testimony of Andrew and even some distant relatives, the defense presented the conclusion that Mark and Sarah raised their children with extreme Christian values, which became even more intense after the arrival of COVID. At that point, the couple grew extremely paranoid, isolating the family even further and starting a new way of life at home that was described as extremely rigid, with a military-like ideology focused on survival, as if some kind of catastrophe was approaching. One of the most valuable testimonies presented by the defense was that of Sarah's mother, who, contrary to what one might expect, supported her grandson by stating that her daughter was abusive and demanding with the children. Because of this, they had argued more than once, and had even threatened to report her to the authorities if she didn't change the way she treated her kids. Despite this new information in the case, the truth is that the judicial process didn't move forward much more. More than a year after the case began, it still hasn't been decided whether Andrew will be tried as an adult or as a minor, and so even less do we know when the trial will actually take place. According to the latest dates that have come out, the last hearing should have taken place in January 2026. Some sources claim that the defense once again requested a postponement so that the last hearing would be held in October of this year, that is 2 years after the events. But the court flatly refused, so if nothing changes, in April the court will have to decide how Andrew will be tried and, therefore, set the date for his trial. As for his sister, the only survivor of the massacre, we know that she's living with some of her relatives, but we don't know anything else. Let's remember that this case is terribly recent, so this is as far as we can go with all the information we have at the moment. There are clearly two sides to this. One says it was an abusive family, and the other says they weren't, or that they were just strict. And Andrew decided to act this way for other personal reasons. What is clear, though, is that his family obviously didn't deserve to be massacred like that. But anyway, let me know what you think about this, and if you'd heard anything about it before. I don't think you've come across much news coverage about it since it's such a recent development, but there are already a few documentaries out there because of how incredibly shocking and tragic the whole situation is, and also because of his younger sister's remarkable ability to survive. So yeah, please feel free to let me know what you think about it. And that's where we'll wrap it up. Here are the channel members. Thank you so much for supporting me through this platform. I really appreciate it a lot. You already know that channel members get to see the videos a little earlier than everyone else, so if you want to join, the button's down there somewhere. Honestly, I can't remember what it's called, but it's right next to the subscribe button. And, well, with nothing else to add, here's a new video and here's a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face, and I'll see you in another video. Bye.